Thank you all for coming, and let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you. Okay, I'm the only speaker here today. So I think I'll try to keep to what I had initially intended, which is 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, if I can stretch it out. And then you can ask questions, and then maybe we could even get out of here early. Okay, a couple months ago, actually about 6 months ago, I was speaking at a Festschrift conference in Melbourne, Australia. And you know what a Festschrift is? It's a German word. It means to, where we honor somebody, usually another scholar. And this Festschrift conference was for my graduate school advisor. She was an alumnus of the University of Melbourne, an Australian. The conference ended with a roundtable discussion on whether it's possible to speak about a University of Chicago School of Russian History. That is, all the students who studied under her at the University of Chicago, we share something in common with each other. And one of my graduate school friends who was speaking on this roundtable said, I promise to give a fully comprehensive answer to this question, whether there's a University of Chicago School of Russian History. And he looked down at his notes, and he looked up, and he said, yes, no, maybe. And then he paused, and there was no response from the audience, and he said, do I need to repeat myself? I mention this because I think the question that I have posed here, will Russia still exist in 2107, is a little like that question, is there a University of Chicago School of Russian History? It's impossible to answer. Although I do want to point out that on one of the circulars that went about by email, two of the numbers were transposed, and the title was, will Russia still exist in 2017? I'm pretty sure it will. But if we add 90 years onto that, there's a level of uncertainty. So I do want to emphasize the maybe. I do think there is reason to be uncertain about whether Russia will survive the next 100 years. And that's what I want to talk about today. I do want to say I'm not the first to say this by any means. In fact, there has been some discussion of this in the popular press. Most recently, in 2001, the Atlantic Monthly published a long article by a writer named Jeffrey Taylor. And the title of the article was, Is Russia Finished? And this article was the catalyst for quite a bit of debate in my field about whether things will continue to get worse in Russia. And for our field, my field has not benefited from the end of the Cold War. In fact, it has suffered immensely from the end of the Cold War. And the author of this article, Jeffrey Taylor, was not a scholar. He was a freelance writer who lived in Moscow for 10 years at the moment he wrote the article, and kind of one of these persons who transformed himself into an entrepreneur in the waning days of communism and took advantage of the newly emergent free market to make money for himself. And when Taylor, in Taylor's article, he looks at the breakdown of public order in post-Soviet Russia, the rise of the mafia. In fact, the rise of the mafia to such a point that it almost constitutes a shadow government in Russia. The open theft of state property through the privatization process that occurred after 1991. And then I guess what we could only call the ubiquity of the absurd in Russian life. And no one who goes to Russia, even for a short amount of time, leaves without realizing, this or acknowledging the ubiquity of the absurd in Russian life. You see it everywhere on the streets. You see babushki, old Russian women selling religious icons, and the newspaper Sovietskaya Rossiya, Soviet Russia, and Zavtra, which means tomorrow. These are communist newspapers. And that seems so inconsonant to me, the fact we can sell religious icons and communist newspapers. When I was in Russia in the spring of 2004, there was a rash of people killed by falling icicles. And this sounds quite funny, you're sort of knocked unconscious or impaled by a giant icicle. But it was seen as a further sign of the breakdown of the contract between citizen and state, that the Moscow municipal government had always taken care to knock icicles down so they didn't injure people when they fell off the buildings. What else is absurd about Moscow? Moscow is a centrally heated city. This is quite novel, I think. In all of Moscow, there are 4 or 5 big boiler plants that heat water, and then they send the water through pipes that flow throughout the city, and this water is used to heat nearly every building in Moscow. Occasionally, these pipes break, and they, especially in the winter, they'll turn the ground into this sort of steaming, quicksand. And I remember in 97, 98, there were several people who lost their dogs. Their dogs would wander around in the courtyards and they would be sucked into quicksand that was, 250 degrees. And there was even a person who jumped in after his dog, and he perished as well. And on that score, let me say that in central Moscow, one of these sort of newly affluent streets, it's called Bolshaya Dmitrovka, which has been turned into a street lined with expensive boutiques and cafes. It's also where the old Institute of Marx, Engels, and Lenin is located, which is this sort of vaguely modernist building that has big bas-reliefs of these great thinkers of communism. Who peer down on the street. Well, right out in front of the Institute of Marx, Engels, and Lenin a couple years ago, a huge chasm opened. The street caved in several stories down, and it swallowed an S-Class Mercedes, which is the car that is preferred by the newly affluent Russians. And it seems so poetic, right? I mean, here are Marx, Engels, and Lenin peering down on this chasm that has swallowed an S-Class Mercedes. And then right across the street is the new Escada boutique, where the new Russians shop. And this is everywhere you walk in Russia. You see examples of the absurd. And Jeffrey Taylor did a really nice job, I think, of describing this all. A friend of mine whose wife is a professional photographer, she really loved Moscow because she said every day she found something completely bizarre that she could photograph. I like Taylor's article a lot. And one of the reasons is Taylor challenges the monopoly that political scientists have on predictive scholarship. And I do think that other social scientists, especially historians and anthropologists and sociologists, need to get into the business of predictive scholarship. Why should we let political scientists say, whether Russia is finished or not? But I also want to point out that political scientists have been, by far and large, wrong on Russia throughout the 1980s and 90s. First, in the 1980s, they said Russia was an incredibly stable place, and we shouldn't expect its immediate collapse. And then in the 1990s, they really reveled in the collapse of communism and the construction of this new market economy. And the key figure here was this Jeffrey Sachs, who at the time was at Harvard. He's now at Columbia. And, he was the chief advisor for what was called shock therapy. Over 500 days, we will float all the prices in Russia and create a market economy. And Jeffrey Sachs, he stayed at the Radisson every time he was in Moscow, and he consulted with Russia's newly empowered entrepreneurs and political figures. But I don't think he had quite the feel for the street that I had. And he certainly didn't realize how impoverishing this transition to a market economy was for the majority of Russians. So I like Taylor's article because he brings this to the forefront. I do have to point out, though, that Taylor has reversed the values that I attach to Russia. I love Russia precisely because it is completely bizarre. One of the reasons I love Russia is when my parents came to visit me, we took them out to dinner. My wife and I took them out to dinner, not realizing that the restaurant we went to had an erotic show. So at 8 p.m., we're sitting there eating dinner, and this scantily clad woman comes out and starts dancing in the middle of the restaurant. It's quite embarrassing, but nonetheless, it's one of the reasons why I love Russia. I do think, though, that the fault lines that Taylor emphasizes may lie elsewhere in Russia, and that's what I want to talk about today. And this will allow me, I hope, to put on my historian's cap and look at the past 75, 80 years in Russian history. Now, one of the really great success stories in 20th century world history was the end of imperialism. 1914, the months before the beginning of the Great War, this really marked the apex of European power, right? I mean, the Europeans controlled, either directly or indirectly, nearly every corner of the world. This changed drastically over the course of the 20th century. So by the 1980s, most parts of the world had achieved either complete sovereignty or some form of limited sovereignty. But the issue of Russian imperialism was not resolved over the course of the 20th century. In fact, what I hope to show today is that the Soviet Union may actually have aggravated non-Russian imperialism on the sort of great Eurasian continent. And so how did this happen? Well, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they didn't have any coherent nationalities policy. Instead, they had a slogan. And it was a slogan that was shared with Woodrow Wilson. And the slogan was, national minorities should have self-determination. So this is immediately paradoxical, right? I mean, Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin essentially had the same view of nationalism in the closing days of World War I. And the Bolshevik slogan was designed to recruit ethnic support for the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks were really amazed by the strength of nationalism as a mobilizing force in the Ukraine, in Finland, in Poland. And so this really forced Bolsheviks to think about nationalism as a force that either could be used to augment the revolution or that could be used to undermine the revolution. And this is hard for Marxists to do, right? I mean, Marxists aren't apt to see nationalism as a force as powerful as class grievances. But certainly one of the lessons of World War I is that it was a powerful force. So in March of 1919, the Soviet Communist Party met in Congress, and they debated what their policy on nationalism should be. And one side in this debate argued that national self-determination was irrelevant. Only classes could have self-determination. And actually, the key figure here was Nikolai Bukharin, which some of you undoubtedly associate as one of the victims of Stalinism, and he was. But here in 1919, he essentially dismisses nationalism out of hand. Lenin disagreed with Bukharin. Lenin argued that nationalism could unite counter-revolutionary activists. And so in nationalism, there was a potential for a class alliance against Bolshevism. So, nationalism might somehow dupe Ukrainian workers into thinking they had more in common with the Ukrainian bourgeoisie than they did with Russian workers. So nationalism had the potential for creating these all-class alliances. And eventually, the Congress debated this for several days, and the Congress sided with Lenin. And this is really crucial. It's one of these crucial moments in Soviet history, the March of 1919, when the Soviet Union essentially devises a nationalities policy. And that nationalities policy, more or less, is the guiding principle for how the Soviet Union treated non-Russians for the rest of its 75-year history. This nationalities policy that they adopted was really rested on three premises. And here I'm relying heavily on the work of a friend of mine, Terry Martin. And if I can drum up a couple sales for his book, it's called The Affirmative Action Empire. It's really one of the most important books that has been published in my field the last couple years. And I do want to say Terry is also the one who said yes, no, maybe in Melbourne last summer. So I am doubly indebted to Terry today. So Lenin's nationalities policy rested on three premises. The first was that nationalism was dangerous because in it there was the potential for an all-class alliance. Okay? Now, it seems to me that the logical response to this then would be to attack nationalism. Right? If nationalism is dangerous, you suppress it brutally wherever it rears its head. This is what Tito did after the war in Yugoslavia. But actually, the exact opposite happened. Lenin thought that by granting limited forms of nationhood, the Bolsheviks could split this national class alliance. By granting limited forms of nationhood, they would prevent Ukrainian workers from siding with Ukrainian bourgeoisie. So in other words, independence, national independence would increase class struggle. National independence would destroy this class alliance that had the potential of existing, at least. And national independence, paradoxically, would decrease the appeal of nationalism. Okay? So that's the first premise of Soviet nationalities policy. The second premise was that nationalism was in an unavoidable stage in human development. Nationalism was not primordial. It had not existed since the origins of humankind. Nationalism was a result of capitalism. This is what the Bolsheviks thought. It was not essential or permanent. It would fade, just like capitalism itself would fade. But it might persist for a long time under socialism. How long, they weren't sure. It could be decades. But this is important because if nationalism is unavoidable, the Bolsheviks thought that it was essentially futile to try to stamp out nationalism. Okay? It's part of the logic of history. So it makes no sense to try to stamp it out. And then third, the Bolsheviks distinguish between good nationalism and bad nationalism. The Bolsheviks argued that non-Russian nationalism was primarily a product of Tsarist oppression. So the Ukrainians were angry at the Russians, not for anything the Bolsheviks had done, but because of decades of Russian oppression of the Ukrainians. And so this leads to really a crucial principle of Soviet nationalities policy, the distinction between good nationalism and bad nationalism, and the nationalism of oppressor nations and the nationalism of oppressed nations. So Russian nationalism was bad because it was the nationalism of an oppressor nation, but Georgian nationalism was good because it was the nationalism of an oppressed nation. So these are the three premises of Soviet nationalities policy. Nationalism was a masking ideology that had in it the potential to create an all-class alliance. National identity was not primordial. Rather, it was a product of the capitalist epoch, and it would fade at some point in the future. And then this distinction between good nationalism and bad nationalism. Now, this is all quite interesting, I think, because it provides the basis for a Soviet nationalities policy that is contrary to what I expect many of you think it was. A couple decades ago, a historian at the Hoover Institute named Robert Conquest wrote a very famous book called Stalin, Breaker of Nations. And the title alone suggests, I think, what Soviet nationalities policy was. It was, we crush nationalism. We crush national self-determination. In fact, that is not at all what Soviet nationalities policy was about. Soviet nationalities policy granted limited forms of nationhood that did not conflict with a unified state, a unified federal state, the Soviet Union. Soviet nationalities policy promoted what was called indigenization, which is a poor translation of a Russian word, korenizatsiya. Indigenization privileged the interests of indigenous peoples over the interests of newcomers. So in Ukraine, the interests of Ukrainians would always be privileged over the interests of Russians. Schools, the language of instruction would be Ukrainian. Or, if you're in Georgia, wherever you are, it would be in whatever the local language was. It would not be in Russia. The head of the local Communist Party apparatus would always be of that nationality. Often the second in command would be a Russian. The Soviet Union was the first state to institute affirmative action policies for these supposedly oppressed nations, the oppressed nations of the old Tsarist Empire. And by the way, they instituted affirmative action on a much wider scale than we ever did here. Now, what does this mean for today? Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, of course, part of the collapse was this split along republic lines, right? So the Soviet Union before 1991 was comprised of 15 union republics. And these union republics corresponded to what were the biggest nationality groups within the Soviet Union. But in some sense, this collapse was incomplete because it left Russia as a whole. In Russia is also the composite of certain national territorial units. In fact, today, the Russian Federation is comprised of 86 federal units. 21 of these are republics that are defined by nation. So the Kalmyks have their own republic. The Moldovians have their own republic. So within the Russian Federation, this provides some limited form of national self-determination. There are 7 Krais. This is a lower level of national autonomy. And then 7 Okrugs. And then, of course, there is the first Jewish homeland, right? The first Jewish homeland was not Israel. It was Birobidzhan in the Soviet Far East. And it is such an inhospitable climate that they didn't find many Jews willing to go there. But nonetheless, it retains its national autonomy, even within post-Soviet Russia. So I think that the question we should ask ourselves today is, was the division along ethnic lines that occurred in 1991 completed? Or is this still a process that is occurring today and will continue to occur between now and 2107? In other words, can we expect more Chechnyas? Right? I mean, Chechnya was an autonomous national territorial unit within the Russian Federation that wanted to be treated the same as the Union republics, who gained full autonomy, full sovereignty in 1991. So can we expect that there will be more Chechnyas over the course of the next 100 years? And let me end on a grim note. As some of you probably know, Russia is facing a demographic crisis today. The total Russian population right now is about 150 million people. That's about half of what the Soviet population was. And it's declining by about 1 million persons per year. And the reasons for this decline are primarily low life expectancy, especially for males. At one point, it dipped below 60. And the reasons were high mortality through alcoholism primarily. But there's also low fertility among women of childbearing age. And there's also quite a bit of outmigration. In fact, so much outmigration that according to some counts now, Russia is the second largest diaspora nation in the world. That is, there are more Russians living abroad than all but one other nation. This demographic crisis has disproportionately affected ethnic Russians. And as the predominance of ethnic Russians fades in coming decades, and of course they're the titular nationality, right? I don't think it's illogical that as the predominance of Russians fade within Russia, that Russia will then begin to reimagine itself. And how it reimagines itself is really crucial. I mean, will it continue to devolve and spin off these newly independent nation states, or will it try to find something else to bind itself together? And this is essentially what the Soviet Union succeeded in doing. The Soviet Union, granted limited nationhood, but then said we are all a part of this process of realizing socialism. Now that process has failed, what will Russia find to bind this political entity together? Okay, so that's all I had to say today. And I'll be happy to take questions if there are any. By God, I spoke for a half an hour. Yeah.
How many times have you been to Russia? I know you stayed for a long period of time. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, more times than I can count now. I went first as a college student on an exchange program. I studied at the Moscow Institute of Steel and Alloys, which is the Russian equivalent of MIT. Strangely enough, they had good Russian language programs for foreigners. And this was right at the end of the Soviet period. And then I returned briefly in 95, and then for a really long stint in 97 and 98. And then for a long while, I was there virtually every summer after becoming a professor. So when all is said and done, it comes out to more than 3 years living there. And I've seen it all. I saw the collapse of communism and the construction of this post-communist society.
You spend much time in the Russian Far East?
No, I mean, not as anything more than a traveler through the Far East. But and I do want to point out that Russia's this huge landmass, and we would think that these non-Russian nationalities live in the Asian part of Russia, and that is true to some extent. But you don't have to go very far from Moscow to find these national territorial units. The city of Kazan, which is famous because it's where Vladimir Lenin went to college. It's due east of Moscow, a couple hundred miles. Kazan is situated in the Tatarstan national territorial unit and has some degree of national autonomy. So even in European Russia, these things exist. Yeah?
What's sort of the state of higher education in terms of both the structure and how students get to go and the quality, what do you know about that?
State of higher education. Well, it's still even by Cal State standards, it's still a pretty good deal to go to college in Russia. It's cheap, I know that. I also know that all my Russian friends were trying to get to universities in the West. But when I was there as an exchange student, and this was partly because I was at the Moscow Institute of Steel and Alloys, it was a technical education. But it was a technical education that had just been freed of this, enforced indoctrination, having to attend the Marxism-Leninism classes. And my Russian friends were much more interested in John Lennon than Vladimir Lenin. But even now that has faded to some extent. And my Russian friends remind me now of some of my students that they think I'm terribly dated, that I don't know who 50 Cent is, or yeah.
Isn't there an overarching confederation in what used to be the Soviet Commonwealth of Independent?
Yeah, the Commonwealth of Independent States.
What part does that have in the nationalization of bringing these nations
Well, the Commonwealth of Independent States was created at the very end of the Soviet period. In fact, this is one of these events that was emblematic of the fact that Gorbachev had no more power, and that Yeltsin had really assumed control of what was left of Russia within the Soviet Union. And the CIS was signed into existence in December of 1991, right as the Soviet Union collapsed, and is essentially an agreement first between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which were the three Slavic entities within the Soviet Union. But then it also grew to encompass other parts of the former Soviet Union. In fact, all other parts except, I believe, for the Baltics, which wanted nothing to do with this because they were, forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union at the end of the war. The CIS, as far as I can tell, it's become almost a completely meaningless organization, similar perhaps to the Organization of American States. It certainly does not impact Russia's relations with its own national territorial units, which exist within Russia. And it has become a comfortable sinecure for prominent politicians. The ambassadorship to the CIS, which is similar, I think, to the OAS, right? I mean, there's always a prominent donor that is appointed ambassador to OAS. But I don't see that as a real determining factor here in the fate of Russia. Yeah, Rick?
When the Soviets were developing their nationalist policy, what did they think, or did the discussions ever enter in about what the U.S. was doing? I mean, the so-called melting pot in the U.S., what did they say or criticize about that?
That was, as far as I know, the United States was not what they were worried about. It was Austro-Hungary was what they were worried about, in the fissioning along ethnic lines that occurred in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the war. And that's precisely the reason why Lenin thought that we have to grant limited forms of nationhood in order to preempt this. So something similar doesn't happen to the Soviet Union. But I think you can say that the United States and the Soviet Union were unique in some regards, and they had some affinity to each other in that they weren't exact nation states, right? We are not a state that defines ourselves by a national identity. We are a creedal people. And the Soviets, similarly, were creedal people, right? I mean, our creed is sort of, liberal free market capitalism. Their creed was sort of anti-capitalist Marxism. The construction, that creed was supposed to produce what was called the Homo Sovieticus, right? And in theory, national identity would fade at some point in the future, and this sort of transnational Soviet identity would trump everything. That never occurred. So I think you could argue that we've been much more successful here at using creed to trump national or ethnic identities. Yeah.
In your opinion,
Was that nationalism policy a more successful approach than, say, what Tito did? In that it didn't, upon dissolution, it didn't erupt into violence so much?
Yeah, that may be the case. I mean, it may be the case by not violently crushing nationalist movements. The Soviets wisely prevented the sort of chaos that occurred in Yugoslavia at the end of the war. But I also think it's the case that the Soviets unwittingly sowed the seeds of their own demise, because they created, in privileging national identity and seeing it as unavoidable and it's futile to struggle against, they actually promoted national identity. And many people who did not conceive of themselves in nationalist terms or in national identity terms were given national identities by the Soviet state. And of course, you were given your national identity when you reached the age of adulthood and you got your internal passport. And on your internal passport, it identified you as a Jew or as a Kalmyk or as a Bashkirt. And so those identities then become real, and they have real repercussions. Your ability to get into university was contingent upon your national identity. It was much harder as a percentage, it was much harder on an aggregate level for Russians to get into university than it was for a repressed nationality to get into university, a Bashkirt. So nationality did have real-life repercussions. Yeah.
Can I ask you to maybe clarify a little bit more? Because when I'm thinking, when you talk about Soviet imperialism, I was thinking more in terms of the relationship with Africa.
Yeah.
Like their role in sort of trying to counter and support Western imperialism by lending, not just the ideological, but material support to non-aligned nations movement.
Yeah.
That kind of support, and but we also know about the role in Afghanistan and so forth. So I guess I'm much more complicated than a picture of some imperialism revolution. But I'm not quite sure I understand. And are you saying that the use of national identity was a way of solidifying the Soviet Empire, and thus it was mostly sort of symbolic?
Well, I mean, I guess you've raised an interesting question. I mean, to what extent can we speak of this whole Soviet project as being an imperial project? And so I guess we have to be careful here how we define imperialism. And I would define an imperial state as a state which is composed, first of all, of a conglomerate of different nations. And then, but nonetheless, a state in which one nation is privileged. And even though even though there were limited forms of national self-determination within the Soviet Union, and even though there was reverse discrimination against Russians because they were the oppressor nation, there is no doubt that Russians were still the privileged nation within the Soviet Union. And this particularly becomes the case in the 1930s when Russian patriotism and Russian nationalism and Soviet patriotism really become indistinguishable. And Soviet heroes really become Russian heroes. So the sort of embrace of Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible under Stalin. But your question about the relations with Africa and the Caribbean and such, do you think is it possible to draw a line between foreign aid and imperial ventures? I mean, when we give money to South Africa, is that because we have an imperial interest in South Africa? Or yeah, I'm asking you a question.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Actually, to speak on it, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's ways in which the Soviet support for Cuba, for example, was both self-interested and supportive of Cuba's own development. But generally speaking, I think foreign aid, it's been shown that foreign aid, particularly in the current period of structural adjustment, foreign aid tends to produce new forms of dependency and eviscerate national independence.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's consistent with the Soviets' relationship too?
Well, clearly, in the post-war period, we could argue that the Soviet relationship with Eastern Europe was essentially an imperial relationship. There was not much difference in the degree of national autonomy that the Hungarians enjoyed after '56 than with what the Ukrainians had. I mean, they answered to Moscow. But I don't know if I would go so far as to suggest that the relations with Cuba were imperial at heart. So you had your...
For my interest, a bit dated, like my knowledge of what's going on there, I remember I was told that the elite ethnic group in Moscow, the party and in the army is Ukrainian, and that many of the high party people and the people of power in Moscow were of Ukrainian origin, even though they were born and raised in Moscow. Is that true, or was it true?
Well, you said what you think your facts may be dated, and in fact they are, but that was the case during the 1950s and 60s. Khrushchev, of course, was of Ukrainian stock, and Khrushchev promoted many people from Ukraine into positions of power, not only within the army, but within the party and within the state, within the government. And I don't want to engage in too much self-promotion here, but I have a book coming out very shortly. It's a memoir I edited of Dmitry Shapilov, who was a Kremlin insider and who was kicked out of power under Khrushchev. And Shapilov criticizes exactly this thing, that people weren't promoted on the basis of merit. They were promoted on the basis of personal connections and the fact that they, 30 years earlier, they had worked with Khrushchev in some party cell in the Ukrainian Donbass. So that certainly was the case. Yeah.
You mentioned the mafia and their incredible power in Russia, and then on the other hand, you have Putin, who actually more and more authoritarian, seeing popping people around.
Yeah.
Is that heading for some kind of a showdown, or is there some kind of a cooperation?
I think the showdown has occurred already, and I think Putin has won. It is Russia is a far more orderly place today than it was 6 or 7 years ago.
Do you see that in everyday life? I mean, is that something that people are experiencing directly?
There are no more $100,000 Mercedes that are exploding on the streets of Moscow. But the mafia, that's even kind of misleading because it suggests an activity which is widely perceived as being illegal. And the line between illegal and legal activities in Russia was so hazy during the 1990s. These I guess we could call, many corporations took on the contours of the mafia, in that they had, paramilitary forces at their disposal, and they used violence against their business competitors, and that has all ended, or at least it has mostly ended. And I think it's to Putin's credit that he has reined that in. It's also the case that he has reined in many liberties that we would see as more essential to a democratic society at the same time. Any other questions? Karen, you had your hand up.
I did. When you started talking, you were talking about how political scientists are very
Well, that's what makes them important, right? Is they predict, and that's why they have government's ear.
And so you had talked about how historians could become what I know. So what do you think is going to happen?
In Russia?
Yeah.
What do I think is going to happen? I am an optimist. And I know my office is right across the hall from Diane Parnes, who's the political scientist here at Sonoma State who does Eastern Europe. And I know Diane and I disagree on this. I am an optimist because I think Russia is essentially becoming what South Korea was in the 1980s, an authoritarian free market economy. Now, of course, South Korea today is very different than it was in the 1980s, and it may be that political liberalization, there will be a second stage of political liberalization, a decade or two out. But I think that they do need to find some way of addressing this, this potential nationalism crisis that exists within the Russian Federation. And it may be that democracy will be the cure for this. Democracy and growing material affluence. I mean, if every national group within the Russian Federation thinks it's getting its fair share of the pie, there will be no need for greater national autonomy. But also, I'm an optimist just because the Russia I know today is so different from what it was, the Russia I first encountered. And Yeah, I often think the press even gets it wrong. I mean, occasionally you read the New York Times about Russians that are nostalgic for Stalin. Nobody's nostalgic for Stalin. What they're nostalgic for is the sort of the order and the certainty of the old way of life. And you know, nobody misses the Great Terror of 1937. Yeah, Rick?
Does Russia have any immigration problems? Is that an issue?
In or out?
Going into the country.
Yes, and this is one of these issues that quickly takes on racial tones. Immigration from Central Asia has been shut off, or at least it's much more difficult now than it used to be, because these people are perceived as terrorists. In 2004, 2005, when I went to Russia in the summer of 2005, the day I landed, a Chechen woman had strapped explosives around her midsection and walked into a rock concert, an outdoor rock concert in Moscow, and blew herself up and killed, several dozen young Russian people. And in the immediate aftermath of that, there was a sweeping of Moscow. And if you were dark-skinned, you were asked for your identity papers. In Moscow is a closed city. So you are not free to move there, even if you're a Russian. You need official permission to live there. And if you don't have a residential permit, you can be deported out of Moscow. So in immigration is a contentious issue, partly because ethnic Russians see themselves as under siege. And then out immigration, interestingly, is also an issue for the same reasons that ethnic Russians perceive themselves as being under siege. And as many of you probably know, Russia has become one of the real providers on the international baby market for adoptions. And this has also gotten much more difficult in recent years, precisely because it is this sort of drain on Russian demographic drain. There was even a very famous case last summer when I was there where a couple had a child taken away from them that they had for a couple weeks, and they were just waiting for the child's papers to be processed, and which is quite sad because presumably they had formed an attachment to this child, and then it was taken away from them. Yeah.
Just a comment. In the Russian Far East, there's a lot of concern about Chinese immigration.
That's right. That's true as well.
Very strong there. Virtually every job is taken now, any kind of manual labor.
Yeah.
By a Chinese immigrant.
In fact, all across the Amur Basin, which is the border between Manchuria and China, Manchuria and Russia, all the cities on the north side of that border are becoming increasingly Chinese. And that has benefited Russia, too. I mean, Russia benefits from that commerce. But there is fear that if this becomes predominantly a Chinese, that's the predominant ethnic group there, that that fosters separatism. The Stalin, during the 1930s, there was a large Korean population in the Soviet Far East, and Stalin responded by simply deporting them. So, anything else?
His response to a lot of.
That was his response to a lot of things. But it's interesting that this idea of the Soviet Union as a conglomeration of national territorial units, that was never challenged. And Stalin could have just said, we wipe these boundaries clean. We are one unified country. There are no national territorial units. But they always preserve those national territorial units. And I think that is quite interesting. Anything else?
Thank you for speaking for an hour.
Thanks.